sun beat down, I had the radio on. I was driving, trees went by, me and Dell were singing.
Hi, welcome to my garage. Today we're going to get busy installing Legend Gear and Transmission's new LGT-700 5-speed into my 66 Pontiac GTO. Legend recently designed various offset shifter positions for the LGT, so I made a call to Mark Bowler to discuss the options for my car. Mark spent a ton of time with me talking about the LGT and the advancements that have been made in the 5-speed market. Not only was Mark very knowledgeable about the transmission, but he kept me in the loop on the progress of the build after the order was placed. So the GTO currently has a Tremec TKO 600 5-speed in the car. So you may be wondering, why do I want to replace the TKO with the LGT 700? Well, as I mentioned before, the LGT brings several advancements to the 5-speed market. The LGT has a nice compact case, making the transmission much smaller in profile than the TKO. This offers up a significant advantage for a no-cut installation. In the case of my GTO, the tunnel's already been modified to accept the TKO, so space isn't much of an issue. However, for the guys that are looking for a no-cut installation, this transmission is the hot ticket. Second is their shift gate track system. The LGT offers up more exact shifts and promises to eliminate the dreaded 2-3 shift that the TKO is plagued by. Third is the oversized synchro system, featuring the latest high energy absorption carbon fiber synchro friction material, which is bonded to precision forged steel blocker rings. This provides low shift effort and also high RPM shifts up to 7,500 RPMs for the life of the transmission. Check out Legend's website for more information on this cool transmission. So let's get started and get the TKO out of the car and get the LGT into the car. Okay, first we got to get the driver's seat out, and once we have the driver's seat out, we can actually get the console out of the car. That'll actually make getting the transmission out a lot easier because we'll have to pull the shifter handle off first before the transmission comes out. So let's go ahead and get the seat out. Now that the driver's seat is not in the car anymore, let's take a closer look at how much space we have between the shift lever and the opening of the console. When in first gear, we actually have quite a bit of space between the shifter and the console opening. Moving back to second gear, we're pretty tight. There's not a lot of room to actually move the shifter handle back a little bit. Moving over into fifth gear, we actually have quite a bit of space on the right side of the shift lever. So that tells us that when we go to put the Legend transmission in this car, that if we had to, we can actually move the shifter handle a little bit further forward and still maintain adequate amount of clearance between the console and the shift lever. Okay, we got the 6 screws out that hold the console in place. Now we're just going to go ahead and lift the console right out of the car. Now that we have the shift boot out of the way, we're going to make some measurements of our existing shifter stub. This will give us a reference of where our existing shifter is actually currently located, so that way when we set up the LGT-700 shifter, we'll be able to position it relatively close to where we are right now and be able to actually minimize how many times we have to take the console in and out of the car to get the position that we're looking for. So first of all, we're going to measure from the heater box to the front of the shifter, which is approximately 16 7/8. And then we're going to measure from the passenger side door over to the left side of the shifter stub, which is approximately 32 inches. So when we set the LGT-700 in the car, we'll position the shifter to these two locations, and hopefully we'll have enough room for the shifter moving inside the console. Alright, before taking the drive shaft out of the car, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mark a line where the actual backside of the seal rides on the slip yoke. And this will be my reference point to see exactly how far the drive shaft yoke actually goes into the existing TKO transmission. Okay, the next thing we want to do is we want to get the drive shaft out of the car, so we're going to go ahead and loosen up the bolts back on the drive shaft and then slip the drive shaft out of the car. Okay, the next thing we want to do is we want to make a measurement from the front of the rear end pinion yoke all the way up to the back end of the transmission. This will give us a relative location of how far we are from the rear end to the back end of the TKO. And then when we make the same measurement when the LGT-700 is in the car, we'll be able to determine whether or not we have enough slip for the yoke to actually fit into the LGT. .59 3/4 inch. Okay, before we take the Tremec out of the car, what we're going to do is give you just a little idea how close the Tremec actually sits to the floor. You'll see the shift rail of the Tremec actually sits real tight up against the floorboards. And the only way that you could actually get the Tremec up any higher is you'd actually have to cut this section of the floor out. And that's something I didn't want to do when I originally installed the transmission. The one thing you're going to notice too is here is the top of the transmission where the shifter mounts in the Tremec comes real close to where the opening is for the shifter porch. And I'm anticipating that actually the LGT will actually give us a lot more room in this area. Okay, we got the exhaust disconnected, we got the cross member bolts removed, we have all the bits and pieces that we need to have removed to get the transmission out of the car. So what we're going to do is get the transmission jack under the transmission, get the bolt loosened up, and get the transmission out of the car. Alright, so when I installed the TKO, I indicated the bell housing and I came within 5 thousandths. So I figured it'd probably be a good idea to go ahead and re-indicate it just to make sure everything's right where it should be within spec. And so what I did is I set up my dial indicator within the registry of the bell housing, and I'm going to have my neighbor rotate the engine for me, and we're going to check and see how this thing comes out. So I have my dial indicator set up on the flywheel, and we made one pass already, and we know where 0 is. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and make another pass and see exactly where our high spot is and indicate exactly how much our high spot is. So Brian, go ahead and let's start cranking slowly. Okay, it's staying at 0 now. It starts to climb a little bit. Right about there, a little bit more. Right about there. Okay, so we're 7 thousandths. Right at the high spot there. Go ahead and keep going. That's as high as it gets. Now we're coming back down to 0 again. And it looks like we're repeatable. So that's good. So we have a total of 7 thousandths, and I believe 10 thousandths is the acceptable measurement for an alignment for a transmission. So it looks like we're actually in pretty good shape for the bell housing alignment. So the next thing we're going to do is take a look at the pilot bearing. Alright, after having indicated the bell housing and it's within spec, I pulled the bell housing off, and what we're going to do is take a look at the pilot bearing, make sure the pilot bearing is in nice shape. Pontiac actually uses a bearing, they don't use a bushing, so it's real easy to check to make sure that the bearing is actually in nice shape. Just stick your finger in there, rotate it around, make sure there's no rough spots. Make sure it doesn't wiggle, make sure it's actually nice and tight, kind of like a bearing should be. And it feels good, which it actually probably should be because it's only about 4 years old and there's only about 4,000 miles on it. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the flywheel off, send the flywheel off to the machine shop, have them regrind the flywheel so that we have a nice clean surface to mount our new clutch to. And once the flywheel comes back, we'll mount it to the engine, and then we'll go ahead and indicate it, make sure that there's no runout on the flywheel. Okay, with the Tremec out of the car, I thought it'd be interesting to set the Tremec side by side with the LGT-700, just to kind of show you the differences between the two transmissions. The LGT-700, as I mentioned before, has got a nice rounded body to it, It's going to fit in the GMA bodies much better than what the Tremec does. The Tremec actually has a very square body, and this is where you get into trouble trying to fit these transmissions in the cars, because the tunnel's real narrow at the top, and you run into trouble in this area as well as this area trying to fit these things in the GMA bodies. Okay, from this angle you notice that the LGT actually has an integrated shifter. It's a really nice piece, really nice high quality shifter. They also actually machined down the back side of the case a little bit to actually help with clearance against the floor. This is one of the problems I had with the Tremec, is that when you put the Tremec in the car, you get the transmission up just so high, and the shift rail actually is real close to the floor, and I couldn't get the transmission up as high as I wanted. So Legend Gear and Transmission really put a lot of thought into this and made sure that this transmission would actually fit into the GMA body without actually having any interference issues. So once we get the flywheel back from the machine shop, we'll actually get everything set up and start the installation process. Okay, so I have the flywheel mounted to the engine, and I have the bolts torqued to spec. And on my indicator all set up, I have it actually mounted to the oil pan, and I have it set up so that the indicator is going to ride right in the middle of its travel. And we should clear all the bolt holes along the inside diameter of the flywheel. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and rotate the engine in a circle and see exactly how our flywheel is going to indicate. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is use my half-inch drive ratchet with the right size socket on the end of it, and I'm going to go ahead and start rotating the flywheel around and watch the needle. Okay, that was 0. Let's go ahead. Watch the needle. It's starting to climb a little bit, and I think we're maxed out right there. So that's 0.006. We're going to go around in a circle, make sure that we get a repeat on it, find out where our low spot is. And we're right about there. That is 0 right there. So what we want to do is keep on going, make sure we get a repeat. We're coming up on our 6,000ths measurement. And we hit it right on the nose. Okay. So we got a repeat coming back around, so that means that we are in good shape as far as being able to get the same measurement twice. And so we're within spec. I don't think you can actually ask for anything more than 6,000ths. And you know, I'm pretty sure that there's some guys that will probably argue with you that you need to be closer than that, but realistically, for this engine, this car, 6,000ths run out on the flywheel is a really good number. So the next thing we're going to do is actually install the bell housing and actually check to make sure the bell housing is perpendicular. Alright, so I have my bell housing mounted to the engine. I have all the bolts torqued to spec. I have my dial indicator set up on the flywheel, and we have the indicator set to ride just on the outside edge of the register. And we're going to slowly rotate this thing around in a circle and actually see what it looks like, making notes of the high and low spots. Because we're going to go up and over the top, I'm going to have to use a mirror to actually see the numbers at the top. So I want to make sure I keep track of which way it's going, either plus or minus. Okay, I'm going to mark this as 0 for the time being. And go ahead and just turn it 90 degrees. Stop right there. Okay, so we're about 2,000ths. Go a little bit more. Right about there. And I'm at about 3,500ths. Okay, go a little bit more. Right about there. I'm at 3,000ths. Okay, a little bit more. Stop right there. I'm at 0. Okay, a little bit more. I'm at 0. A little more. Okay, this one I'm coming up to about 1, 0.001. Okay, a little bit more. Keep going. Stop right about there. We're about 3 thousandths there, a little bit more. Stop right there. We're about 3 thousandths there. Come back around. A little bit further. Keep going. A little more. Okay, good. Stop right there. Okay, so we have repeatability all the way around the circle. We saw 0 in this spot a couple of times, and then we also saw between 3 and 3.5 thousandths on this side. The spec on the bell housing, we're looking for anything less than 10 thousandths. Less is better, much like the flywheel runout. And at this point, I would say the bell housing is good to go. I think we have all of our measurements set up. We can go ahead and install the clutch and actually install the transmission. Okay, so the flywheel's been torqued to a spec. It's 100 foot-pounds with blue Loctite on the threads and ARP assembly lube underneath the washers. I'm going to go ahead and clean up any little miscellaneous lube that may have kind of come out between the head and the washer, just to make sure nothing's going to splatter on the clutch. So the next thing we're going to do is actually install the pressure plate and the clutch and get that ready to go. And once we get that done, then we're actually going to set the bell housing on the transmission just to check to make sure the bell housing fits right on the transmission, make sure there's no slop. And then once we do that, we can put the bell housing on the motor, and then we'll be ready to actually put the engine into the car. Alright, so we have the clutch installed. Pressure plate's been torqued down to spec. ARP recommends 40 foot-pounds on the bolts in a crisscross pattern, kind of making your way from one side to the other in small increments. And they also recommend blue Loctite on the threads and also ARP assembly lube on the bottom side of the heads. So I used my clutch alignment tool that came in the clutch kit. It's this cheap plastic clutch alignment tool. It gets you somewhat close. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And so work to try to get the clutch kind of in the middle of the wiggle room that the tool gives you. And so I think we're going to be in pretty good shape. So what I'm going to do is take you over by the bell housing and show you how it fits on the transmission. Alright, so we have our bell housing mounted to the transmission. The bell housing slides onto the transmission pretty easily. There's no burrs or anything. Everything looks nice and clean, so it should actually molt up there really nice and flat. The main thing is to make sure that it doesn't fit too tight, so you have to force it on. You also don't want it to be too loose either, so that way it wobbles on there either. And this is one of the distinct advantages for actually aligning the bell housing to the engine, so that way when you do put the transmission on there, any sort of little tolerances are taken up by the fact that you actually already did make the alignment with the bell housing with the engine. So the next thing is to actually take the bell housing and mount it to the engine, and then once we got that, then we can slide the transmission in place. Alright, so I have the bell housing installed on the engine. Everything's been torqued to spec. And the one thing you want to remember to do is put the clutch fork on the bell housing before you actually install it in the engine. Otherwise, you'll actually have to take it back out and reinstall it. You also want to make sure that you lube the pivot point for the clutch fork. I use Moly Lube because it seems to stay put even with heat. And also you're going to want to put a little bit of lube inside the bearing as well. Just enough for when it slides back and forth on the alignment shaft of the transmission that it doesn't bind. And again, I like using a little bit of Moly Lube because it doesn't seem to want to run when it gets hot. So the other thing I want to talk about is clutch geometry as well, clutch fork geometry. Before I actually had this Lakewood clutch fork on the motor, and my old Pontiac factory clutch fork was in pretty bad shape, and I couldn't find another one, so I bought this Lakewood unit. And I ended up having to use an adjustable ball stud because the Lakewood unit has quite a bit different geometry than what the factory Pontiac clutch fork does. So I recently found a nice used clutch fork for the Pontiac. It's actually made for this car. It's got the factory geometry. And so I went back to the factory ball stud and put that back in the bell housing and installed the factory clutch fork. So everything should actually release and engage a little bit better than what it did when I was using this Lakewood unit. So the next thing is to actually go grab the transmission and slide it in here and see if it fits. All right, let's go ahead and get this thing in there and see if it fits. Alright, looks good. Bolts up nice and good. Looks like we're in pretty good shape. So I'm going to go ahead and get the bolts in and get it tightened down, and then we'll take a look and see how good our crossmember fits. Alright, so the transmission's in the car. I have everything bolted up. I have it temporarily held in place with the crossmember, and I have a little bit of an interference issue that we're going to have to address. I'm going to have to actually grind a little bit of the crossmember to clear the backside of the transmission. Also, I want to give you a little idea of how you can actually install one of these in a convertible without actually having to move the crossmember mounting pads on the frame. It's a simple bracket that I made back when I put the Tremec in, and it works out really well, and especially with putting this transmission in, the extra set of holes that I put in there actually made it really easy to get the crossmember back to where it should be. Here's a look at the bracket that I made when I went to put the TKO in the car a few years back. The factory mounting spot is welded to the frame, and I didn't want to have to cut the welds and move the pad back and then re-weld it to the frame. Instead, I took 2 pieces of 1/8" steel and made a custom bracket that relocates the crossmember back using the factory frame pads for support. The first piece is flat and is contoured to fit alongside the existing frame pad. The second piece is welded to the first piece and has a right angle to it, which helps with strength. Since this bracket only experiencing shear stresses, it made sense to secure the end of the bracket with a 3/16 cap screw. In the end, we have a bracket that will allow us to relocate the crossmember back without having to make an entirely new crossmember. You'll notice that actually there's 4 holes in the factory frame pad, and all 4 holes are actually utilized. This hole here is actually utilized with a stud that actually is welded into the bracket that I made. These 2 holes were actually used for mounting the TKO. These 2 holes will actually be mounted for actually locating the crossmember for the Legend. Okay, we're almost done. We just got to button up a few more things underneath the bottom side of the car, and then we'll go inside and take a look, see how the shifter actually fits. Have the exhaust back on, crossmembers in. I actually modified the crossmember just a little bit to give it some clearance between the crossmember and the transmission. And so that's all done. It's all been bolted up on the sides. And now what we have to do is actually measure from the pinion up to the back end of the transmission, just to see if our measurements are the same as what they were with the Tremec, just to make sure we don't have to go and modify the drive shaft. If you recall, our measurement from before was 59 3/4, and I am measuring from the yoke up to the back end of the transmission at 59 3/4. So the transmissions are physically the same length. The one thing I did notice on the Tremec is that the tail shaft actually hangs out, the actual tail shaft itself hangs out about 200 thousandths beyond the actual end of the transmission. So you have to take that into account when you're checking your slip yoke, just to make sure that you have enough slip inside the transmission, so that way you don't end up with any vibration issues. So I'm going to go ahead and make that calculation, and let's hope that the drive shaft actually does come out to be the right length. Alright, the drive shaft's in, the U-joint is torqued down, and I think we're good on slip. And so now what we can do is we can move to the top side of the car. However, I wanted to just give you a little tour of the bottom side, just to kind of show you how everything kind of went together, just kind of give you an overview. And this way you kind of have an idea of what you're going to run across when you do your transmission install. Okay, final impressions before we go to the top side of the car. The transmission's in and it really fits nice. The Tremec was really tight alongside the tunnel, and in the area alongside the transmission I can fit my entire hand over the top of the transmission, and there is a bunch of room up there. I can actually fit my almost up to my wrist, and that is a definite improvement over what the Tremec is. And you know, even with the transmission stuffed up there as tight as I could possibly get it, there's still quite a bit of room. Now granted, my tunnel's actually been modified a little bit, so every installation is probably going to be a little bit different, but my impression is that even if the tunnel wasn't modified, this transmission would still fit in here pretty well. On the passenger side of the transmission, the one area that I can see that's a little tight is up in this area. I don't know if you can see it very well, it's pretty dark up in there, but that area is kind of tight. For me, it's not that big of a deal because I did modify my tunnel a little bit, and I do have the transmission up there quite a ways. But for the guy that actually wants to install this into a car that hasn't been modified, you may find a little bit of an interference in this area here, but realistically that would be a minor modification to get that to fit. Nowhere near the modification that you'd experience with the Tremec TKO 600. Alright, on the top side of the car, I pulled the shifter porch out because I needed to make a little modification to fit my boot. And so I cut the shifter porch open a little bit further, and when I go to install the boot, it'll actually clear that a little bit better. The one thing you'll notice is that the shifter porch is not a factory shifter porch. This is a custom unit that I made for when I actually installed the Tremec. Because I had to broaden the tunnel a little bit, the Tremec actually caused the factory shifter porch to not quite fit. So this is a custom unit that I made, and I'm going to keep on using it until at some point I decide to close up the tunnel. You notice on the top side of the transmission we have tons of room like I showed you before. Going all the way to the front of the transmission, the tunnel's really wide open there. Even with the modification that I made, I think you could close that up and still clear this side of the transmission pretty easily. The only area that it gets a little tricky is this area back in this part of the transmission. And I'm going to have a discussion with Mark Bowler and Jack Sims and see if there's something that we can do to maybe modify this part of the transmission to either somehow put an angle in it or maybe chamfer it or something, such that when you're actually installing this transmission in a factory car and you want to get that transmission up there really high up in the car, that you won't have a problem with actually clearing the tunnel at all. So I'm going to go ahead and put the shifter porch on, and we're going to set up the shifter and try to get the console in today too yet. Okay, check this out. I'm putting the shifter in, and actually Legend supplies a really cool shifter piece. This thing is splined in two different directions, and so that as the shifter pad actually moves around a circle, the shifter can actually rotate along with that, and it's offset as well. So this will allow you to actually get almost any location that you want within a certain degree, and be able to actually keep it really nice and secure. The splining on this thing is actually beautiful. They did a nice job with manufacturing on this piece. I'm going to throw this in the car. Alright, if you recall, when I actually took the console out, I made some measurements so that way I could get the shifter pretty close to where I want it, so that way I'm not taking the console back in and out several times to kind of get it lined up. So I have actually installed the shifter mechanism such that it's pretty close to the measurements that we had when we pulled the console out. And so what we're going to do is actually set the console in there, hopefully just once, and just double check it before I actually put the boot on. So, but I want to give you a close-up of what it looks like when you actually have the shifter installed. You can see how much adjustment that these shifters actually have. Okay, here you'll see I actually have the shifter bolted up to the transmission. I've clocked a little bit towards the front, and I actually rotated this piece a little bit too. It actually works out nice because of the splining that they have. When you move one, you move the other, and they kind of move together. So it actually makes it real simple to actually set this up. And so what I'm going to do is actually slide the boot down and fit the console in, make sure everything's going to fit and not hit. The one thing you're going to notice is that this is not a standard 66 GTO boot. I don't think a 66 GTO boot would actually fit with this transmission. This boot is actually out of a 68. So this just worked well for when I was running the Tremec, and I'm going to keep on running the same boot with the Legend. Well, we're at a point in the project where it's time to actually put the fluid in the transmission. Now, Legend actually recommends a couple different types of fluid. They have a Mobile One ATF that they recommend. There's also the Royal Purple Synchromesh that they recommend. But the one fluid that actually stands out from the rest of them is the AMSOIL Manual Synchromesh Transmission Fluid. And that is the fluid that actually I chose. It's a Wisconsin-based company, so I might have a little bias. But the one thing that's for certain is that actually AMSOIL makes an excellent product. And you know, and actually it's a little bit cheaper than what the Royal Purple is. So the transmission gets a little over 3 quarts of oil, so we're going to continue filling it and get to the point where we can fire this thing up and take it for a run. The final verdict, it's an awesome transmission. Nice smooth shifts, quiet, and a quality piece. Something you expect out of an American company like Legend Gear and Transmission. Thanks to the guys at Bowler Transmission for getting it to me so quickly, and thanks to the guys for Legend Transmission for making this thing happen.